I spent 43 years building a life for my family, and on Christmas morning, my own daughter handed me a plate of reheated leftovers while serving her mother-in-law a feast I had paid for. That moment, sitting alone at my own kitchen table with cold turkey and lumpy gravy, I realized I had become a stranger in the home I built with my own hands. What I did next changed everything between us forever. I woke up on Christmas morning at 6:47 a.m., just like I have every Christmas for the past 30 years. The house was quiet, which should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. It felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with the silence, and everything to do with how invisible I'd become in the home I built with my own hands. I lay there in what used to be the guest bedroom, my bedroom now, apparently, listening to the sounds of my family starting their Christmas morning upstairs. My daughter Sarah's voice, my son-in-law Mark's deeper laugh, the excited chatter of my grandchildren. All of it happening above me, like I was buried beneath their lives instead of being part of them. 3 years ago, Helen and I would have been up before anyone else, her in the kitchen making coffee, me checking the tree one last time to make sure all the presents looked perfect. We had our routine, our quiet moments before the chaos began. Now I'm the chaos they try to manage. If you've ever felt forgotten in your own home, if you've ever wondered how you became a stranger to the people you love most, then you understand what I'm about to tell you. And if this story touches something in your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment. Your support means more than you know. I got dressed slowly, the way I do everything now. There's no rush when nobody's waiting for you. I could hear footsteps above me, the excited squeals of my grandchildren discovering their presence. I should have been up there, in my house, with my family, watching their faces light up with joy. Instead, I was putting on my slippers in a room that smells like mothballs and regret. When I finally made it upstairs, the living room was already in full Christmas chaos. Wrapping paper everywhere, the kids playing with new toys, Sarah and Mark sitting on what used to be my couch, drinking coffee from what used to be my favorite mugs. They looked up when I entered, gave me those polite smiles you give to distant relatives. "Morning, Dad," Sarah said, not getting up. "Coffee's in the kitchen if you want some." The kitchen, my kitchen, where I've made coffee every morning for 30 years, but now I need permission, or at least directions, like I'm a guest who's never been here before. I was pouring myself coffee when I heard the sound that always makes my stomach tighten, the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Margaret's pristine white Cadillac, gleaming in the morning sun like some kind of royal carriage come to collect what's rightfully hers. Margaret, Sarah's mother-in-law, the woman who's somehow become more important to my family than I am. I watched from the kitchen window as she stepped out of that car, perfectly dressed even at 8 in the morning, her arms full of expensive gifts wrapped in gold paper with elaborate bows. She moves with the confidence of someone who knows she belongs, who knows she's wanted. I used to move like that in my own home. The front door opened without a knock. She has a key now, apparently. And suddenly the house came alive in a way it hadn't when I walked upstairs. Sarah jumped up. Mark straightened his shirt. The kids ran to greet her with genuine excitement. "Grandma Margaret," my 8-year-old grandson Tommy shouted, throwing his arms around her waist. Grandma Margaret, not just Margaret or Mrs. Sullivas. But Grandma. When did that happen? When did she become family while I became... what am I now? "Merry Christmas, my darlings," she said, her voice warm and melodious. She has one of those voices that sounds like it should be reading bedtime stories or hosting cooking shows. Helen's voice was softer, more musical, but Margaret's voice commands attention in a way that fills rooms. I stood in the kitchen doorway, coffee cup in hand, watching this reunion happen in my living room. Nobody noticed me there. Margaret was distributing hugs and kisses, asking about the morning, admiring the presents. Sarah was helping her out of her coat. Mark was taking her packages. The kids were bouncing around her like puppies. "Where should I put these gifts, sweetheart?" Margaret asked Sarah. "Just set them anywhere," Sarah replied. "Dad already opened his presents earlier." Dad, that's me. The dad who opened his presents earlier, alone, while the real family gathered upstairs. 2 gifts this year. A generic sweater from Sarah and Mark that still had the discount store tag on it, and a coffee mug from the grandkids that said "World's okayest grandpa," not best grandpa, or even great grandpa, just okayest. Even my 7-year-old granddaughter knows I'm just okay. Margaret settled into my recliner, the one Helen bought me for my 60th birthday, the one that fits my back perfectly, the one I've spent 3 years breaking in just right. Margaret needs it for her arthritis, Sarah explained months ago. Just temporarily, just until she gets her own chair reupholstered. That was 6 months ago. Sarah, honey, is there anything I can do to help with breakfast? Margaret asked, already making herself comfortable in my chair. Actually, yes, Sarah said, and I felt a little flutter of hope that maybe they'd include me in the morning routine. Could you help me get the good china down? I want to make this morning special. The good china, Helen's china, the set we got for our wedding, and only used on Christmas and anniversaries. Sarah was getting it down for Margaret. Of course, dear, Margaret said, rising from my chair with the grace of someone whose joints don't creak, whose back doesn't ache, whose body hasn't spent 72 years earning every pain. I'll be delighted to help. They moved to the dining room together, their voices mixing in comfortable conversation about place settings and flower arrangements. I followed at a distance, still holding my coffee, still waiting for someone to notice I was there. The dining room table, the one I built with my own hands in this very house 40 years ago, was being set with Helen's china. The good silverware came out next, the crystal glasses we kept wrapped in tissue paper, the cloth napkins that only came out for special occasions. This is beautiful china, Margaret said, holding up one of Helen's plates to the light. Sarah, your mother had exquisite taste. She did, Sarah agreed. Dad always said she could make a paper plate look elegant. They talked about Helen like I wasn't there, like I hadn't been married to her for 45 years, hadn't held her hand when she picked out that china, hadn't watched her lovingly wash each piece by hand after every special dinner. I was the footnote in Helen's story, not the co-author. Should we set a place for your father? Margaret asked, and my heart jumped with pathetic gratitude that someone had remembered I existed. Oh, Sarah said, pausing with a fork in her hand. Dad usually likes to eat in the kitchen. He says the dining room feels too formal now. I've never said that, not once. I've never said the dining room feels too formal. What I've said, quietly and to no one in particular, is that I don't want to intrude on family dinner when Margaret's there. What I've said is that maybe they'd be more comfortable without me hovering around. But somehow that became my preference for kitchen eating, my choice to be excluded. The morning continued like this, me orbiting around the edges of my own family's Christmas celebration. Margaret held court in my living room, dispensing gifts and wisdom and gentle corrections about everything from the temperature of the coffee to the way the presents were arranged under the tree. Sarah hung on her every word like she was receiving instructions from a general she deeply respected. My grandchildren, bless them, would occasionally remember I existed and bring me a toy to admire or a picture to look at. But even those moments felt borrowed, like I was getting the leftover attention after Margaret had been properly consulted and praised. Grandpa, look at my new doll. My granddaughter Emma showed me a beautiful porcelain doll with real hair and an elaborate dress. That's beautiful, sweetheart, I said, and I meant it. Did Santa bring that? No, Grandma Margaret did, Emma said matter-of-factly. Santa brought me socks. Socks. Santa, apparently operating on my budget, brought socks. Grandma Margaret, with her endless resources and impeccable taste, brought museum-quality dolls. By mid-morning, the smell of Christmas breakfast was filling the house. Real breakfast. Not the simple eggs and toast I make for myself most mornings, but the kind of elaborate spread Helen used to prepare. Sausage and bacon, fresh biscuits, fruit salad arranged in Helen's good crystal bowl, coffee cake that looked like it came from a bakery. I realized Margaret must have brought most of the food. Sarah's not much of a cook, never has been, but Margaret moves around a kitchen like she owns it, which, in a way, she does. She owns my kitchen more than I do these days. Breakfast is ready, Sarah called, and everyone migrated to the dining room. Everyone except me. I waited. Surely someone would call me, would notice I wasn't there, would save me a seat at my own table, but the conversation flowed around the dining room without any pause for my absence. I could hear Margaret complimenting the coffee, Sarah laughing at something Mark said, the kids chattering about their presents. Finally, I walked to the dining room doorway. Every chair was taken. Margaret sat at the head of the table, my spot, where I've sat for 30 years, looking perfectly natural there. Sarah and Mark flanked her on either side. The kids had claimed the remaining chairs, their plates full of food, their faces bright with Christmas joy. There was no place set for me. "Oh, Dad," Sarah said when she noticed me standing there. "I'm sorry. We didn't think you'd want to join us. You've been so quiet this morning." Quiet. I'd been quiet because no one was talking to me. I'd been invisible because no one was seeing me. "Let me fix you a plate," Sarah said, jumping up. "I'll bring it to you in the kitchen." And that's how it happened. That's how I found myself sitting alone at my kitchen table on Christmas morning, staring down at a paper plate. A paper plate, filled with reheated food from yesterday's dinner. Cold turkey, lumpy gravy, stuffing that had gone dry, mashed potatoes that looked like paste. From the dining room I could hear the warm buzz of family conversation, the gentle clink of Helen's good china, the soft laughter that comes with comfortable togetherness. Margaret's voice rose above the others occasionally, telling stories about her late husband, sharing memories of Christmas past, dispensing advice about everything from child rearing to home decorating. I took a bite of the cold turkey and had to force myself to swallow it. Not because it tasted bad, but because it tasted like defeat. It tasted like being forgotten. It tasted like spending Christmas morning as a stranger in the house I built, eating leftovers while someone else sat in my chair, at my table, with my family. The worst part wasn't the cold food or the paper plate or even sitting alone. The worst part was realizing that this felt normal to everyone else. Sarah wasn't being cruel. She genuinely thought she was being considerate by bringing me food. Mark wasn't trying to hurt me by not saving me a seat. He probably didn't even notice I wasn't there. The kids weren't rejecting me. They were just following the lead of the adults around them. And Margaret wasn't trying to replace me. She was just being herself, being helpful, being present in ways I hadn't figured out how to be since Helen died. But sitting there with that paper plate, I realized something that cut deeper than any intentional cruelty could have. I had become optional. I had become the family member you accommodate when convenient, include when there's room, remember when someone thinks to ask. I had become a guest in my own life. The gravy had a skin on top of it, the way gravy does when it sits too long. I broke through it with my plastic fork. They'd given me a plastic fork while everyone else ate with Helen's good silverware, and tried to remember when I'd stopped fighting for my place at that table. When had I become the kind of father who accepts leftovers on Christmas morning? When had I become the kind of man who apologizes for existing in his own home? From the dining room, I heard Margaret's laugh, warm and genuine, followed by Sarah saying, "Oh, Margaret, you're so right about that." My daughter, seeking approval and wisdom from a woman who'd known her for 5 years, while her father sat 30 feet away, forgotten and feeding himself scraps. I put down the plastic fork and looked around my kitchen. Really looked at it. The cabinets I'd installed myself, learning how to do it from library books because we couldn't afford to hire professionals. The backsplash Helen and I had tiled to get. Her one weekend, arguing good-naturedly about the pattern, laughing when we realized we'd done half of it backwards. The window over the sink where she used to stand every morning, watching the sunrise while she made coffee. This was my kitchen. This was my house. This was my family. And I was eating Christmas dinner alone, off a paper plate, like some kind of charity case they were too polite to turn away. That's when I understood, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, that I had let this happen. Somewhere in my grief, somewhere in my loneliness, somewhere in my desire not to be a burden, I had stepped aside so quietly that no one noticed I was gone. But I noticed now. Sitting there with cold gravy and lukewarm shame, I noticed everything. The fork felt heavy in my hand as I sat there, staring at those congealed mashed potatoes. How does a man disappear from his own life? How does a father become a footnote in his family's story? The answer came to me slowly, like pieces of a puzzle I'd been too afraid to put together. It started 3 years ago, the day we buried Helen. I remember standing at her graveside, surrounded by family and friends, feeling like the ground beneath my feet had disappeared along with my wife. 45 years of marriage, and suddenly I was just me. Not half of Bill and Helen, not the father of Sarah's family, just Bill. 72 years old and starting over with no idea how to be a person instead of a couple. The house felt impossibly big that first night. Every room echoed with her absence, her coffee cup still in the sink, her reading glasses on the nightstand, her pillow still smelling faintly of her shampoo. I'd walk into the kitchen expecting to see her at the stove, turn to tell her something before remembering she wasn't there to listen. For months, I barely functioned. Sarah would call every day, worried about me eating properly, sleeping enough, taking my medications. She'd drive over twice a week with groceries I didn't ask for, cleaning supplies I didn't use, concern I didn't know how to accept gracefully. "Dad, you can't just sit in that chair all day," she'd say, finding me in Helen's spot on the couch, staring at the television without really watching it. "You need to get out, see people, do things." But I didn't want to see people. I didn't want to do things. I wanted to sit in that house filled with 43 years of memories and feel close to the only person who'd ever really understood me. I wanted to grieve in peace, without schedules or expectations or well-meaning advice about moving forward. Sarah didn't understand that grief isn't something you recover from like a cold. It's something you learn to carry, like a stone in your chest that never quite settles into a comfortable position. She meant well, but her concern felt like pressure. Her visits felt like inspections. Her suggestions felt like criticism of the way I was handling my loss. Then Mark lost his job. It happened about 18 months after Helen's funeral. Some corporate restructuring, downsizing, the kind of thing that happens to men in their 40s who've worked for the same company for 15 years without realizing they'd become expendable. Sarah was scared. They had the house payments, the kids' school expenses, all the costs of modern family life that require two incomes to manage. "It's just temporary," Sarah said when she brought up the idea of them moving in with me. "Just until Mark finds something else. It would help us save money, and honestly, Dad, we worry about you living alone in this big house." The house isn't that big. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen and living room and dining room. Helen and did I raise Sarah here, hosted family gatherings, built a life that felt exactly the right size for what we needed. But when you're living alone, I suppose any house feels too big. I said yes because I thought it would help. I thought having them there would fill some of the emptiness Helen had left behind. I thought my grandchildren's voices would bring life back to rooms that had grown too quiet. I thought family dinners around the table Helen and I had shared for decades would feel like a return to something normal. I was wrong about almost everything. The first thing that changed was my bedroom. Sarah and Mark needed the master bedroom, she explained, because it was bigger and had the attached bathroom. The kids would take Sarah's old room and the guest room. That left me with the small bedroom downstairs, the one we'd used for storage and the occasional overnight guest. "It's probably better for you anyway, Dad," Sarah said as she helped me move my clothes. "No stairs to worry about, and you'll have more privacy down here." Privacy, that was the word she used. Not isolation, not banishment, but privacy. Like I'd requested to be separated from my family instead of having my own bedroom, redistributed without consultation. The room was smaller than I'd realized, barely large enough for my bed and dresser. The window looked out at the neighbor's fence instead of the backyard garden Helen had tended for 20 years. The walls were thin enough that I could hear every conversation, every television show, every late-night discussion happening above my head. But I told myself it was temporary. Mark would find a job, they'd move out, and I'd get my room back. In the meantime, I had my family close, and that was worth any inconvenience. Then Margaret started visiting. At first, it was perfectly reasonable. Sarah had mentioned that Mark's mother was lonely since her husband died, that she lived alone in a big house across town, that she missed having family around. When Margaret started coming over for Sunday dinners, it seemed natural enough. 2 widowed grandparents, sharing meals with their children and grandchildren. But Margaret didn't just visit. Margaret arrived. She'd pull up in that spotless Cadillac carrying homemade casseroles, fresh flowers, carefully wrapped gifts for the children. She remembered everyone's favorite foods, their birthdays, their school schedules, their extracurricular activities. She had opinions about everything from child discipline to home maintenance, and she shared them with the confidence of someone who expected to be heard. Most importantly, she had money, real money, the kind that comes from good investments and careful planning, and a late husband who'd been successful in business, money that could pay for dance lessons and summer camps and new school clothes and all the things that young families struggle to afford. I watched Sarah's relationship with Margaret develop with a mixture of admiration and uneasiness. Margaret was everything I wasn't. Energetic where I was tired, social where I was withdrawn, generous where I was careful with money, confident where I was uncertain about my place in this new family dynamic. Margaret thinks we should enroll Emma in piano lessons, Sarah would say over dinner. She's offered to pay for them. Margaret found this wonderful pediatrician for Tommy's allergies. She's going to help me get him an appointment. Margaret has some great ideas about redecorating the living room. She says the furniture arrangement is all wrong for the flow of the room. The furniture arrangement I'd lived with for 30 years was suddenly wrong. The pediatrician we'd used for Sarah's entire childhood was suddenly inadequate. The activities I'd provided for my grandchildren were suddenly insufficient. Margaret wasn't trying to replace me, I told myself. She was just being helpful. She was just being a grandmother. She was just being present in ways I'd forgotten how to be since Helen died. But slowly, steadily, I began to notice the small ways I was being edged out of my own family's daily life. Margaret would arrive early and stay late, making herself useful in ways I couldn't match. She'd help with homework while I watched television. She'd plan weekend activities while I napped in my chair. She'd offer solutions to problems I didn't even know existed, while I struggled just to keep up with the conversation. My opinion stopped being sought on family decisions. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, like a dimmer switch being turned down so slowly you don't notice the room getting darker until you realize you're sitting in shadows. "We're thinking about switching the kids to a different school," Sarah might mention casually, over breakfast. Not asking what I thought, not including me in the discussion, just informing me of decisions that had been made without my input. "Margaret found this great summer camp for Tommy. We're going to sign him up. We've decided to redo the bathroom upstairs. Margaret knows a contractor who'll give us a good deal." We. Sarah and Margaret had become we. I had become the person they told things to after the decisions were made. The bathroom renovation was when I realized how completely my role had shifted. They were redoing the master bathroom. My bathroom. The one Helen and I had shared. The one where she'd brushed her teeth every morning for 43 years. Margaret had ideas about tile and fixtures and color schemes. Sarah was excited about the improvements. Nobody asked me what I thought about changing the bathroom where I'd spent 4 decades of mornings getting ready for work alongside the woman I loved. Nobody considered that I might have feelings about erasing one more piece of the life Helen and I had built together. I was the homeowner, but I wasn't consulted. I was the father, but I wasn't included. I was paying for half the renovation. Margaret graciously offered to cover the other half, but I wasn't part of the planning. When I tried to express some concerns about the cost, about the disruption, about the changes being made to Helen's space, Sarah looked at me with gentle exasperation. "Dad, it's just a bathroom," she said. And honestly, it needs updating. Margaret's ideas are really good, and she's being incredibly generous with her contribution. Just a bathroom. The place where Helen used to sing in the shower, where we'd stand side by side at the mirror getting ready for church every Sunday, where I'd helped her with her medications during those last difficult months. Just a bathroom. That night, lying in my small bedroom, listening to Sarah and Margaret discussing paint colors and tile patterns, I realized I'd become a tenant in my own home. A tolerated presence, accommodated but not consulted, housed but not honored. The final piece of my disappearance happened so gradually I almost didn't notice it. My routines, my preferences, my small daily comforts began to be modified for Margaret's needs. She preferred the house cooler than I liked it. She had allergies to certain cleaning products I'd used for years. She couldn't tolerate the smell of my morning coffee, so I started making it weaker. She needed quiet in the mornings for her meditation, so I learned to move more softly, speak more quietly, exist more carefully. "Dad, could you not run the dishwasher in the evening?" Sarah asked one day. "It keeps Margaret awake, and she's having trouble sleeping." Margaret, who lived across town in her own house, was having trouble sleeping because of my dishwasher, and somehow that became my problem to solve. I started washing dishes by hand in the evenings, standing at the sink Helen used to claim as her domain, quietly cleaning up after dinners. I'd been gradually excluded from preparing, planning, or even fully participating in. The morning I apologized for using my own bathroom was the morning I understood how completely I'd disappeared. Margaret was visiting for the weekend, staying in Sarah's old room, and she'd been waiting to use the hall bathroom when I came out. "Oh, I'm sorry," I said automatically, stepping aside as she approached with her toiletry bag. "I didn't know you were waiting." "No problem at all," she replied graciously. "Take your time." But I'd already stepped aside. I'd already apologized. I'd already treated my own bathroom like a shared resource that I needed permission to use. Standing in the hallway, watching Margaret close the door to my bathroom, I realized I'd been apologizing for existing in my own home for months without even noticing it. Apologizing for making noise, for taking up space, for having needs and preferences and routines that might inconvenience the woman who'd somehow become more important to my family than I was. That evening, as I hand-washed the dinner dishes alone in my kitchen while Margaret and Sarah planned the next day's activities in the living room, I understood something that felt like a physical weight settling in my chest. I hadn't lost my place in my family through any dramatic confrontation or conscious decision. I'd lost it through 1,000 small accommodations, 1,000 quiet compromises, 1,000 moments of stepping aside to make room for someone who moved through life with more confidence, more resources, and more energy than I could muster in my grief. I'd become invisible by trying so hard not to be a burden that I'd forgotten how to be present. I'd disappeared by being so afraid of being unwanted that I'd stopped asserting my right to be seen. And the most painful part was that nobody had pushed me out. I'd stepped aside, inch by inch, day by day, until I was standing so far on the margins of my own life that my family had learned to function perfectly well without me. The cold mashed potatoes on my paper plate suddenly tasted like all of those small defeats, all of those quiet compromises, all of those moments when I'd chosen invisibility over inconvenience. But sitting there on Christmas morning, eating leftovers in my own kitchen while my family celebrated in my dining room with my wife's china, I realized something else. I didn't have to stay invisible. I didn't have to keep apologizing for existing. I didn't have to accept being optional in my own life. The question was whether I still had the courage to step back into the light. I could hear Margaret's voice from the dining room, warm and animated, telling some story that had everyone laughing. Even from the kitchen, even through my growing resentment, I had to admit the truth. Margaret wasn't a villain. That's what made this whole situation so much harder to understand, so much harder to fight. If she'd been cruel or manipulative, if she'd deliberately set out to push me aside, I could have rallied against her. I could have pointed to specific wrongs, called out obvious slights, demanded better treatment. But Margaret was nice. Genuinely, consistently, almost aggressively nice. She brought homemade cookies every time she visited. She remembered my grandchildren's favorite flavors and their food allergies. She asked about my health, complimented my home, thanked me graciously for my hospitality, even though she was the one doing most of the hosting in my own living room. The terrible truth was that Margaret was better at being a family member than I'd learned to be since Helen died. She was better at it than I'd ever been, maybe. I took another bit of cold turkey and let myself really think about Margaret for the first time in months. Really examine what made her so successful at taking over my life without anyone noticing, including me. Margaret was 70 years old, 2 years younger than me, but she moved through the world with an energy I envied. She'd been widowed around the same time I lost Helen, but where I'd retreated into grief and solitude, she'd somehow transformed her loss into purpose. She volunteered at the hospital, organized charity events, maintained an active social calendar that would exhaust people half her age. "Staying busy keeps me from dwelling," she'd told Sarah once, when my daughter commented on how well she was handling her husband's death. Robert wouldn't want me to sit around feeling sorry for myself. Robert. Even in death, Margaret's husband remained a motivating force in her life. She spoke about him often, but not with the desperate clinging to the past that I recognized in my own grief. She talked about him like he was still advising her, still encouraging her, still present in her decisions in positive ways. When I talked about Helen, which I rarely did anymore, it was usually to explain why I couldn't do something, couldn't go somewhere, couldn't participate in some activity. Helen always handled that. Helen was the one who was good with people. Helen wouldn't have liked that idea. My dead wife had become my excuse for remaining stuck while Margaret's dead husband had somehow become her inspiration for moving forward. Margaret had money, yes, but it wasn't just the money that gave her influence in my family. It was how she used it. She didn't throw cash around carelessly or make people feel indebted to her generosity. She invested in experiences, in opportunities, in small improvements to daily life that made everyone feel cared for. She didn't just buy my grandchildren expensive toys. She paid for piano lessons that helped Emma discover a talent she didn't know she had. She funded a summer science camp that sparked Tommy's interest in astronomy. She covered the cost of new school clothes, but she made it a special shopping trip where each child felt important and valued. When she contributed to household expenses, she did it quietly, through Sarah, without making me feel like a charity case. The utility bills just got a little easier to manage. The grocery budget stretched a little further. The house repairs that I'd been putting off suddenly became affordable. I never felt explicitly replaced by Margaret's money. I felt gradually supplemented, enhanced, improved upon. And Margaret was social in ways I'd forgotten how to be. She knew how to ask questions that got people talking about themselves. She remembered details from previous conversations. She could find common ground with anyone: the mailman, the grocery store clerk, the pediatric nurse, the school principal. I watched her with my grandchildren and saw skills I'd never developed, not even with Sarah when she was young. Margaret got down to their level, literally and figuratively. She'd sit on the floor to play games, ask genuine questions about their interests, listen to their rambling stories with the patience of someone who truly enjoyed their company. When Tommy got excited about dinosaurs, Margaret didn't just nod politely. She checked out library books about paleontology, learned the names of different species, engaged him in conversations that made him feel like his interests mattered to adults. When Emma started drawing horses, Margaret found art supplies specifically designed for young artists, encouraging her with techniques and suggestions that helped her improve. I love my grandchildren deeply, but I realize now that I'd be in loving them the way I knew how. Quietly, from a distance, with simple activities like watching television together or reading the same 3 picture books over and over. Margaret loved them actively, creatively, with an investment of time and attention that helped them grow. Even with Sarah, Margaret had developed a relationship that I envied and resented in equal measure. They talked on the phone almost daily, sharing details about their lives that went far beyond polite conversation. Margaret knew about Sarah's work frustrations, her marriage concerns, her worries about the children's development, her dreams for the family's future. When had I stopped being Sarah's confidant? When had I become the person she managed instead of the person she consulted? Somewhere in my grief, I'd stopped asking about her life in ways that invited real answers. I'd stopped offering advice or support or even curiosity about her daily struggles and victories. Margaret, meanwhile, had become Sarah's advisor, cheerleader, and friend. She offered practical solutions to problems, emotional support during difficult times, and celebration during happy moments. She was present in ways that mattered, available in ways that helped, interested in ways that showed she cared about more than just being polite. The dining room erupted in laughter again, and I could hear Margaret's voice rising above the others. "Oh, that reminds me of the time Robert tried to assemble a bicycle on Christmas Eve." She told stories. Good stories, funny stories, stories that connected her past to their present, that made her late husband feel like someone they'd all known and loved. She shared her history in ways that enriched family conversations instead of stopping them. When I mentioned Helen, which was rare, it usually came out as a complaint or a comparison that made everyone uncomfortable. Helen never would have approved of that. Things were different when Helen was alive. Helen always said, "I'd turned my wife's memory into a weapon of disapproval instead of a gift of shared love." Margaret had turned her husband's memory into a bridge that connected her to other people's experiences. But it wasn't just Margaret's social skills, or her generosity, or even her energy that had allowed her to take my place in my family. It was her confidence. Margaret moved through life like someone who expected to be welcomed, included, valued. She assumed her presence was a gift. Her opinions were worth hearing. Her contributions mattered. I'd been moving through life like someone who expected to be tolerated, excluded, forgotten. I assumed my presence was a burden. My opinions were outdated. My contributions were insufficient. And people, I was learning, tend to treat you the way you expect to be treated. Margaret expected my grandchildren to enjoy her company, so she planned activities they'd find engaging. I expected them to be bored by me, so I didn't plan anything at all. Margaret expected Sarah to value her advice, so she offered thoughtful suggestions about everything from parenting to career decisions. I expected Sarah to see me as out of touch, so I kept my opinions to myself. Margaret expected to belong in my home, so she made herself comfortable, useful, essential. I expected to be displaced, so I stepped aside to make room for someone who seemed more deserving of the space. The most painful realization was that Margaret wasn't trying to replace me. She was simply being herself. Engaged, generous, confident, present, while I was busy disappearing. She was filling the vacuum I'd created through my own withdrawal from life. She didn't push me out of my family. I'd pulled myself out, inch by inch, day by day, and she'd naturally expanded to fill the space I'd vacated. From the dining room came the sound of chairs scraping against the floor, people getting up from the table, the comfortable bustle of a family meal ending. Soon they'd all migrate to the living room, where Margaret would hold court from my recliner while I sat in whatever chair was left, if any. But sitting there with my paper plate of cold food, I realized something that felt like a small flame igniting in my chest. Margaret might be better at being a family member than I'd learned to be, but that didn't mean I couldn't learn. Margaret might be more confident and social and generous than me, but that didn't mean I was destined to remain invisible. Margaret might have taken my place, but she hadn't stolen it. I'd given it away, piece by piece, through months of stepping aside instead of stepping up. The question was whether I had the courage to stop stepping aside, whether I had the strength to reclaim not just my chair or my place at the table, but my role as a father, a grandfather, a man who mattered in his own home. The cold gravy on my plate had formed a skin thick enough to wrinkle when I stirred it. I looked at that congealed mess and made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I was done eating leftovers in my own home. I was done apologizing for existing in the space I'd built with my own hands. I was done watching someone else live my life while I sat in the kitchen with the scraps. Margaret might be wonderful, and she was, but this was still my house. This was still my family. And it was time I reminded everyone, including myself, that I still had a place at the table I'd built, in the home I'd created, with the people I'd loved longer than anyone else. The sound of footsteps approached the kitchen, and I braced myself for whatever came next, but for the first time in months, I wasn't preparing to apologize or step aside or make myself smaller. For the first time in months, I was preparing to stand up. I stirred the congealed gravy with my plastic fork and felt something break open inside my chest. Not my heart. That had been cracking slowly for months. This was different. This was the dam that had been holding back 40 years of Christmas memories, and suddenly they were flooding through me with the force of a river breaking free. Sarah, at 5 years old, her hair in pigtails tied with red ribbons Helen had sewn from fabric scraps. She'd wake us up at dawn on Christmas morning, bouncing on our bed in her footy pajamas, too excited to wait for a reasonable hour to start opening presents. Is Santa here yet? Did he eat the cookies? Did Rudolph eat the carrots? Helen would make coffee while I built a fire in the fireplace, both of us moving quietly through our Christmas morning routine while Sarah vibrated with anticipation in the living room. We had our roles, Helen and I. She handled the kitchen magic, the cinnamon rolls that made the whole house smell like heaven, the hot chocolate with tiny marshmallows, the special Christmas breakfast that turned an ordinary morning into something sacred. I handled the technical Christmas requirements, untangling lights, assembling toys that came with instructions written in 3 languages, making sure the camera had film to capture every moment of wonder on Sarah's face. I remember the Christmas Sarah was 8 and wanted a bicycle more than anything else in the world. Not just any bicycle, but a specific pink one with streamers on the handlebars and a basket for carrying her dolls. It cost more than we could reasonably afford that year. Helen was still working part-time at the library, and my salary at the hardware store barely covered our mortgage and utilities. But Helen and I made a plan. We'd put aside $10 from every paycheck, skip our usual dinners out, make our coffee at home instead of buying it at the diner. For 3 months we saved every spare dollar, and I worked extra shifts whenever Mr. Patterson needed someone to cover the weekend hours. I'll never forget the night I brought that bicycle home, hidden in the back of Tommy Morrison's truck because our car was too small. Helen and I assembled it in the garage after Sarah went to bed, both of us fumbling with the instructions, arguing quietly about which bolt went where, laughing when we realized we'd put the front wheel on backwards. She's going to love this, Helen whispered as we attached the streamers to the handlebars. She better, I said, tightening the last bolt. This bike cost me 3 months of overtime and a dozen lunches of peanut butter sandwiches. Helen kissed my cheek, her hand still smudged with grease from the chain. That's what makes it perfect. Christmas morning, Sarah's scream of joy when she saw that bicycle could probably be heard 3 houses away. She hugged me so tight I thought my ribs might crack, and Helen took pictures of us with that old Polaroid camera, the kind where you had to shake the photos to make them develop. I still have one of those pictures somewhere, Sarah and me, both grinning like fools, her small hand on the bicycle handlebars, my arm around her shoulders. Helen wrote on the back of it in her careful cursive, Christmas 1987, worth every sacrifice. Worth every sacrifice. That's what love was supposed to be, wasn't it? Making things happen for the people who mattered most, even when it cost you something. Especially when it cost you something. I took another bite of cold turkey and let myself remember the Christmas I built the dining room table. Sarah was in high school then, bringing friends over for study groups and sleepovers, and Helen had been hinting for months that we needed a bigger table for family dinners. Not hinting, she'd corrected me when I teased her about it. Stating a fact. We can't keep asking people to sit on folding chairs when we have company. The truth was, we couldn't afford a new dining room table. Good furniture cost money we didn't have, and the cheap stuff looked like what it was. Cheap. But I'd been learning woodworking from books I checked out of Helen's library, practicing on small projects in the basement workshop I'd set up with tools I'd bought one at a time from garage sales and estate auctions. I could build us a table, I suggested one evening in October. It wouldn't be fancy, but it would be solid. Helen looked at me with that expression she got when she was trying to decide if I was being practical or foolish. Do you really think you could? I think I could try. That November and December, I spent every evening after work in that basement, measuring and cutting and sanding and staining. Helen would bring me coffee and sit on the steps, watching me work, offering opinions about the height and shape and finish. It needs to seat 8 people comfortably, she'd say, but not be so big that we can't have a conversation across it. It needs to be sturdy enough that the kids can do homework on it without wobbling. It needs to look like it belongs in our house, not like something you built in the basement. That last comment stung a little, but Helen was right. She had good taste, and I wanted to build something she'd be proud to use for company dinners and holiday meals. Christmas morning, 1995, I led Helen and Sarah to the dining room with their eyes closed, my heart pounding with nervousness. What if it looked amateurish? What if the stain job was uneven? What if the proportions were wrong for the room? Okay, I said, you can look now. Helen's gasp was everything I'd hoped for. The table sat perfectly in our dining room, the chair, rice stain glowing warm and rich in the morning light, the simple lines elegant enough for company, but sturdy enough for daily use. Bill, she whispered, running her hands along the smooth surface. It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. Sarah was impressed too, but in the way teenagers are impressed by their parents' competence. Surprised that we could actually accomplish something noteworthy, but trying not to show too much enthusiasm. It's really nice, Dad, she said, and coming from a 16-year-old, that was high praise. We ate Christmas breakfast at that table for the first time that morning, Helen using her good china because she said the table deserved proper dishes. The proportions were perfect, big enough for the whole family plus guests, but intimate enough that we could have quiet conversations over coffee. For 25 years, that table had been the center of our family life. Homework sessions and bill paying, birthday dinners and holiday feasts, late night talks when Sarah was in college and needed advice about boys or classes or career decisions. Helen had died sitting at that table, actually. Not during some dramatic final moment, but on a quiet Tuesday morning in April. I'd made coffee and toast, and we were reading different sections of the newspaper, the comfortable silence of a couple who'd shared thousands of mornings together. She'd looked up to comment on some article about the city council, and I'd looked up to respond, and I'd seen something change in her expression. Helen? She'd reached across that table toward me, and I'd caught her hand just as she collapsed forward. The paramedics worked on her right there, on the table I'd built with my own hands, but she was already gone. The doctor said it was quick, painless, the kind of heart attack that takes you before you even know what's happening. For months after the funeral, I couldn't eat at that table. I'd make my meals and take them to the living room, or eat standing up at the kitchen counter, or skip eating altogether. The table felt too big for one person, too full of her presence, too empty without her voice. When Sarah and her family moved in, I'd been grateful to see the table being used again. Family dinners, homework sessions, the grandchildren's art projects spread across the surface I'd sanded so carefully all those years ago. It felt like the table was alive again, serving its purpose, justifying the weeks of work I'd put into building it. But now Margaret sat at the head of that table, in the spot where Helen used to sit, in the spot where I'd sat for the past 3 years, being served Christmas dinner on Helen's china, while I ate reheated leftovers off a paper plate in the kitchen. The irony was sharp enough to cut. I'd built that table with my own hands so my family would have a beautiful place to gather for meals and celebrations. I'd sanded every inch of its surface, applied 3 coats of stain, sealed it with polyurethane that took days to cure properly. I'd measured twice and cut once, as my father had taught me, because good furniture was built to last for generations. And now I wasn't even allowed to sit at it on Christmas morning. The memories kept flooding back, each one a small knife twist in my chest. The Christmas Sarah brought her first boyfriend home from college, and Helen made enough food for 12 people because she was nervous about making a good impression. The Christmas morning, Sarah called to tell us she was pregnant with Tommy, and Helen cried happy tears while she made plans for converting the guest room into a nursery. The last Christmas, Helen was alive, when she was already getting weak, but insisted on making her mother's stuffing recipe because it's not Christmas, whoa, without proper stuffing. I'd helped her in the kitchen, reading ingredients while she mixed and seasoned, both of us knowing it might be the last time we'd cook Christmas dinner together, but neither of us saying it out loud. "Promise me something," she'd said while we waited for the turkey to finish roasting. "Anything. Promise me you won't disappear after I'm gone. Don't become one of those men who just fade away. Sarah's going to need you. The grandchildren are going to need you." "I'm not going anywhere, Helen. I don't mean geographically. I mean emotionally. Promise me you won't let grief turn you into a ghost." I'd promised, holding her hand in the kitchen while the smell of Christmas dinner filled our home. I'd promised I'd stay present, stay engaged, stay alive in ways that mattered. But sitting in that same kitchen 3 years later, eating cold food off a paper plate while my family celebrated without me, I realized I'd broken that promise completely. I hadn't just faded away, I'd actively erased myself from the life we'd built together. Helen would be horrified to see me now. Not just because I was alone on Christmas morning, but because I was accepting it. Because I'd let myself become the kind of man who apologizes for existing in his own home, who steps aside instead of stepping up, who takes leftovers instead of claiming his rightful place at the table he'd built with his own hands. I could hear Margaret's voice from the dining room, probably complimenting the stuffing or asking for the recipe. Helen's stuffing recipe, the one she'd learned from her mother, the one she'd taught Sarah to make, the one that connected 4 generations of Christmas mornings in our family. How many more family traditions would I watch from the sidelines? How many more memories would be made without me while I sat in the kitchen with the scraps, invisible and forgotten, and quietly disappearing from the life I'd spent 40 years building? The plastic fork snapped in my hand, broken from the pressure I'd been applying without realizing it. I stared at the 2 pieces, white plastic against the cold gravy, and felt something shift inside me. 40 years of Christmas mornings, 40 years of building memories, traditions, connections that were supposed to last for generations. 40 years of loving my family with everything I had, sacrificing what needed to be sacrificed, working overtime to buy bicycles, learning woodworking to build furniture, staying up until dawn to assemble toys and arrange perfect Christmas mornings. And this is what it had come to: cold food, plastic utensils, and invisible gratitude while someone else sat at my table, in my chair, with my family. Helen's voice echoed in my memory. "Don't let grief turn you into a ghost." But I had become a ghost. I'd haunted my own house for 3 years, present but not really there, visible but not really seen. I'd let Margaret step into the space I'd vacated, and I'd told myself it was noble, generous, the right thing to do. It wasn't noble, it was cowardice. It was easier to disappear than to fight for my place. It was easier to accept leftovers than to demand the respect I'd earned through 4 decades of devoted fatherhood. But ghosts, I realized, have a choice. They can keep haunting the edges of life, or they can choose to become fully alive again. Looking at that broken plastic fork, I made a decision that felt like stepping back into my own body after years of floating outside it. I was done being a ghost in my own home. I was done eating leftovers while other people enjoyed the feast. I was done watching my family celebrate without me while I sat in the kitchen with the scraps of a life I'd built with my own hands. It was time to reclaim my place at the table I'd made, in the home I'd built, with the family I'd loved longer and better that, and anyone else in that dining room. It was time to stop being grateful for crumbs and start demanding the meal I deserved. The broken plastic fork lay in 2 pieces next to my paper plate, and I stared at it like it was some kind of sign. Maybe it was. Maybe sometimes the universe gives you these small, obvious symbols when you're too stubborn or too afraid to see the bigger picture on your own. I could hear them in the dining room, the warm murmur of my family finishing their Christmas breakfast. Real breakfast, served on real plates, eaten at the real table, with real conversation and real laughter and real connection. Everything I'd been excluded from in my own home. Something was building in my chest, something I hadn't felt in so long I'd almost forgotten what it was. Not anger exactly, though there was anger there. Not sadness, though sadness had been my constant companion for 3 years. This was something harder, more solid. This was determination. I stood up from the kitchen table, my chair scraping against the floor I'd installed myself 20 years ago. Everything in this house, I'd built or bought or maintained with my own hands, my own money, my own sweat. The floors, the cabinets, the plumbing, the electrical work I'd learned from library books because we couldn't afford to hire professionals. This was my house. Not legally, I'd never be petty enough to throw around property deeds, but morally, emotionally, practically. I'd earned my place here through 40 years of mortgage payments and home improvements and late nights fixing whatever broke. I'd earned my place with my family through decades of showing up, providing, protecting, loving them with everything I had. When had I forgotten that? When had I started acting like I needed to earn my place in the life I'd built? From the dining room came Margaret's laugh, followed by Sarah saying something I couldn't quite hear, then Tommy's voice, excited about something, and Emma giggling in response. The sounds of a family enjoying each other's company, celebrating Christmas morning together, without me. I looked down at my paper plate with its cold, congealed food, and suddenly I could see myself from the outside. A 72-year-old man, eating reheated leftovers alone in his kitchen on Christmas morning while his family celebrated in the next room. A man who'd been so afraid of being a burden that he'd made himself invisible. A man who'd been so grateful for any attention at all that he'd accepted scraps instead of demanding his rightful place at the feast. When had I become this person? When had I become the kind of father who apologized for existing instead of celebrating the fact that he'd raised a family, built a home, created a legacy worth being proud of? Helen's voice whispered in my memory again, "Don't let grief turn you into a ghost." But I hadn't just become a ghost. I'd become a grateful ghost, thanking people for the privilege of haunting the edges of my own life. Grateful for the small bedroom instead of demanding my master bedroom back. Grateful for paper plates instead of insisting on eating at my own table with my own dishes. Grateful for cold leftovers instead of expecting to be served fresh food in my own home. Grateful, always grateful, for whatever scraps of attention and inclusion my family was willing to spare. That's when it hit me, standing in my kitchen with a broken plastic fork and a plate of cold food. I wasn't just allowing this to happen. I was enabling it. I was making it easy for my family to forget about me by never insisting on being remembered. I was making it comfortable for them to exclude me by never making exclusion uncomfortable. Margaret didn't have to fight for her place at my table because I'd never fought for mine. Sarah didn't have to consider my feelings when making family decisions because I'd trained her to be. Believe my feelings didn't matter. My grandchildren didn't run to me for help or comfort because I'd taught them, through my own withdrawal, that I wasn't really available for running to. I'd spent 3 years teaching my family that I was optional, and they'd learned the lesson perfectly. But teachers, I realized, can always teach new lessons. I walked to the kitchen doorway and looked into the dining room. Margaret sat at the head of my table, My table, the one I'd built with my own hands, telling some story that had everyone's attention. Sarah was laughing. Mark was nodding appreciatively. The children were listening with the kind of focused attention they used to give me when I'd tell them stories about their grandmother or about my own childhood. Margaret's plate was nearly empty, but what remained looked fresh and appealing. Proper gravy without a skin on top, stuffing that wasn't dried out, turkey that hadn't been sitting under a heat lamp. She was eating the Christmas breakfast I'd paid for, at the table I'd made, with the family I'd raised, being served by the daughter I'd supported for 36 years. And she deserved it, according to the logic my family had developed. She deserved it because she was vibrant and social and helpful. She deserved it because she had money and energy and ideas for improvement. She deserved it because she was present in ways I'd forgotten how to be. But what had I done to deserve cold leftovers on Christmas morning? What had I done to deserve eating alone while my family celebrated without me? What had I done wrong except grieve my wife's death and struggle to figure out how to be a single person after 45 years of being half of a couple? Standing there in my kitchen doorway, looking at my family gathered around my table, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt angry. Not the bitter, resentful anger that eats you alive from the inside, but the clean, righteous anger that gives you strength to change things that need changing. I was angry that I'd been so afraid of being a burden that I'd made myself irrelevant. I was angry that I'd been so grateful for any inclusion at all that I'd accepted exclusion as normal. I was angry that I'd let grief and loneliness turn me into a shadow of the man I'd been when Helen was alive. Most of all, I was angry that I'd broken my promise to Helen. I'd let grief turn me into exactly the kind of ghost she'd been afraid I'd become. But anger, real anger, the kind that comes from recognizing injustice instead of just feeling sorry for yourself, is useful. Anger gives you energy. Anger gives you clarity. Anger gives you permission to stop accepting what's unacceptable. I looked at Margaret's beautifully arranged plate, still half full of fresh, hot food, and I made a decision that felt like stepping back into my own life after 3 years of watching it from the outside. I was going to do something, not something dramatic or cruel or designed to hurt anyone's feelings, something simple, something that would make a point without making a scene, something that would speak louder than any argument I could make with words. I was going to serve justice, one plate at a time. My heart was pounding as I walked back to the kitchen counter. When was the last time my heart had pounded with purpose instead of anxiety? When was the last time I'd felt this focused, this determined, this sure that I was about to do exactly the right thing? I could hear Sarah's voice from the dining room. "Margaret, would you like some more coffee? I just made a fresh pot." "That would be lovely, dear. This has been such a wonderful morning." Wonderful morning. It had been wonderful for everyone except the man who'd made it possible by paying for the food, providing the house, and building the table they were all enjoying together. But that was about to change. I picked up the serving spoon Sartar's had left on the counter and walked toward the dining room with the kind of calm determination I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't going to yell or make accusations or demand apologies. I was simply going to make sure everyone got what they deserved. Starting with Margaret. The dining room went quiet when I entered, not because they were uncomfortable, but because they were surprised to see me. I'd trained them so well to expect my absence that my presence had become noteworthy. "Dad," Sarah said, looking up from the coffee pot she was holding. "Do you need something?" "I need to make sure our guest gets the full Christmas experience," I said calmly, walking to Margaret's place at the head of my table. Margaret looked up at me with that gracious smile she always wore, the one that made it clear she was prepared to be patient with whatever awkward social situation I was about to create. "That's very thoughtful of you," she said, "but really, I have everything I need." "No," I said, reaching for her plate. "I don't think you do." What happened next took maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like it unfolded in slow motion. I picked up Margaret's plate with its fresh food and proper presentation. I walked back to the kitchen and scraped every bite of it onto my paper plate. The warm turkey, the smooth gravy, the stuffing that still had moisture, the vegetables that hadn't been sitting under a heat lamp. Then I took my cold leftovers and arranged them carefully on Margaret's good china, the congealed gravy, the dried-out stuffing, the turkey that had been carved hours ago. I added the cloth napkin, positioned the silverware properly, even added the small flower arrangement that Sarah had placed at Margaret's setting. When I walked back into the dining room carrying that plate of cold food, the silence was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I set the plate in front of Margaret with the same careful attention Sarah had used when serving her the fresh meal. Then I sat down in the chair closest to the kitchen, not at the head of the table where I belonged, not yet, but at the table I'd built, with the plate I deserved. Margaret stared down at the cold food, confusion clear on her face. Sarah's mouth was hanging open. Mark had frozen with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Even the children seemed to sense that something significant had just happened, though they probably couldn't articulate what. "There," I said, cutting into my properly prepared turkey with Helen's good silverware. "Now everyone has what they deserve." The silence stretched out like a held breath, and I realized that for the first time in 3 years I was exactly where I belonged, at my table, in my house, with my family, eating food that hadn't been relegated to leftover status. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't apologizing for existing, I was insisting on it, and it felt like coming back to life. The silence in the dining room was so thick you could have cut it with Helen's good silverware. I took a bite of the properly prepared turkey, warm, moist, seasoned the way Helen used to make it, and let the moment stretch out. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Just sit in your truth and let other people figure out how to respond to it. Margaret was the first to speak, which didn't surprise me. She'd been handling awkward social situations with grace for 70 years. "I'm sorry," she said softly, looking down at the plate of cold food I'd placed in front of her. "I think there's been some mistake." "No mistake," I replied, taking another bite of turkey. "This is what I was served for Christmas breakfast in my own home. I thought you might like to try it." The words came out calmer than I felt inside. My heart was racing with something between terror and exhilaration. When was the last time I'd stood up for myself? When was the last time I'd insisted on being treated with the respect I'd earned through decades of being a devoted father and husband? Sarah found her voice next. "Dad, what are you doing?" "I'm making sure everyone gets the proper Christmas experience," I said, not looking up from my plate. "Margaret's been so generous with her time and attention. I wanted her to understand exactly what kind of hospitality we've been providing." Mark shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, but not sure whose side he was supposed to be on. The children were looking back and forth between the adults like they were watching a tennis match they didn't understand but knew was important. Margaret, to her credit, didn't make a scene. She just looked at the cold food, then at Sarah, then back at me with something like understanding starting to dawn in her eyes. "Oh," she said quietly. "Oh, I see." And I could tell she did see. Margaret wasn't stupid, and she wasn't cruel. She was a woman who'd been welcomed into my family with such enthusiasm that she'd probably never stopped to consider who was being displaced to make room for her. Sarah, meanwhile, was starting to look genuinely distressed. "Dad, I don't understand what you're trying to prove here." "I'm not trying to prove anything," I said, finally looking up at my daughter. "I'm trying to show you something. Do you know what I was doing at 6:47 this morning?" "Sleeping?" Sarah guessed. "Lying in bed in what used to be the guest room, listening to my family start Christmas morning without me. Do you know where I ate breakfast?" Sarah's face was starting to flush. "In the kitchen, but Dad, I always eat in the kitchen because there's never a place set for me at my own table," I interrupted, my voice still calm but with steel underneath it. "I always eat in the kitchen because Margaret needs the dining room for family time. I always eat in the kitchen because somehow, in my own home, I've become the person who gets the leftovers." The word leftovers hung in the air like an accusation, which I suppose it was. "That's not... We didn't mean..." Sarah started, then stopped. She looked around the table, at the good china, the cloth napkins, the carefully arranged place settings that everyone had except me, and I could see her beginning to understand what she'd been doing without realizing it. Margaret spoke up then, her voice gentle but firm. "Sarah, honey, this is your father's home. He shouldn't be eating leftovers on Christmas morning while I get the good china." And there it was, the acknowledgement I'd been waiting 3 years to hear, not from Margaret, She didn't owe me anything, but from someone in my own family. The simple recognition that something was wrong with this picture, that the man who'd built the table and bought the food and raised the family shouldn't be the one eating cold scraps in the kitchen. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and I felt a twist of guilt in my stomach. I didn't want to make her cry on Christmas morning. I didn't want to ruin anyone's holiday. But I also couldn't keep pretending that being invisible in my own home was acceptable. "I didn't realize," she whispered. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize we were—" "Making me feel like a stranger in my own house?" I suggested gently. "Making me feel like I needed permission to exist in the space I built with my own hands?" Mark finally found his voice. "Mr. Patterson, we never meant to make you feel unwelcome. When we moved in, we just thought—" "You thought I needed taking care of," I finished for him. "You thought I was too old, too sad, too lost in my grief to have opinions about how my own home should be run. You thought Margaret's ideas were better than mine, her presence more valuable than Minute, to her comfort more important than mine." "That's not true," Sarah protested, but even as she said it, I could see her reviewing the last 6 months in her mind, seeing pattern after pattern of exactly what I was describing. "Sarah," I said, leaning forward slightly, "when was the last time you asked my opinion about a family decision? When was the last time you included me in planning a holiday meal? When was the last time you considered whether I might want to sit at my own dining room table instead of assuming I preferred the kitchen?" She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. We both knew the answer was, "I can't remember." Tommy, my 8-year-old grandson, broke the silence with the kind of blunt honesty that only children can manage. "Why didn't Grandpa get the fancy plates like Grandma Margaret?" Out of the mouths of babes. Even an 8-year-old could see that something was wrong with the seating arrangements at this family gathering. "That's a very good question, Tommy," I said, smiling at him. "What do you think?" Tommy considered this seriously. "I think everyone should get fancy plates on Christmas." "I think you're absolutely right." Margaret had been quietly observing this exchange, and now she stood up from her chair, my chair, the head of the table where I'd sat for 30 years. "I think," she said with the kind of dignity that comes from recognizing a mistake and choosing to correct it gracefully, "that I should probably head home. This is a family conversation that needs to happen without an audience." "Margaret, no!" Sarah started to protest. "You don't have to leave. This isn't about you." But Margaret held up her hand with a gentle smile. "Actually, dear, it is about me. Not entirely, but partly. And your father is right to point out that I've been treated like an honored guest while he's been treated like, well, like someone whose comfort doesn't matter as much as mine." She looked directly at me then, and I saw something in her eyes that surprised me. Respect. "You built a beautiful table, Bill. You should be sitting at the head of it, especially on Christmas morning." "Margaret, you don't have to go," I said, and I meant it. "This isn't about driving you away. This is about making sure everyone understands their place in this family." "I know," she replied, "but I think some conversations are better had without the mother-in-law present, don't you?" She was giving us space to work this out as a family, which showed more wisdom and grace than I'd given her credit for. Margaret gathered her purse and coat, kissed Sarah and the grandchildren goodbye, and paused next to my chair on her way out. "Thank you for the lesson," she said quietly. "I needed to learn it." After she left, the dining room felt different, smaller maybe, or more intimate, like we could finally have the conversation we'd been avoiding for 6 months. Sarah was crying now, not dramatically, but with the quiet tears that come when you realize you've hurt someone you love without meaning to. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she said. "I never wanted you to feel. I never meant to make you feel like you didn't matter." "I know you didn't mean to," I said gently, "but intent isn't the same as impact, and the impact has been that I've felt like a stranger in my own home for months." Mark was nodding, looking uncomfortable but honest. "We got so caught up in Margaret's help, in how much easier she made everything, that we stopped thinking about how it might affect you." "It's not about Margaret," I said, wanting to be clear about this. "Margaret is a lovely woman who was trying to be helpful. This is about me feeling like I had to earn my place in my own family instead of just belonging here." Emma, my 7-year-old granddaughter, had been listening to this whole conversation with the serious attention children give to adult problems they don't fully understand but know are important. "Grandpa," she said in her small, clear voice, "do you want to sit in the big chair?" The big chair, the head of the table, my place for 30 years, the place I'd given up so gradually I'd barely noticed it happening. "I would like that very much, Emma," I said. "Thank you for asking." As I moved to the head of the table, my table, in my house, with my family, I felt something shift inside me. Not just relief or satisfaction, but something deeper. I felt like myself again. Like a father and grandfather who deserved respect, not just tolerance. Like a man who'd earned his place in this family through decades of love and sacrifice and showing up. Sarah brought me a proper place setting without being asked. Helen's good china, the cloth napkin, the crystal water glass. It was a small gesture, but it felt like an acknowledgement, an apology, a promise to do better. "Can we start Christmas morning over?" she asked, her voice still thick with tears. I looked around the table at my family, my daughter who'd forgotten but was trying to remember, my son-in-law who was learning to see me as more than just an aging inconvenience, my grandchildren who were watching their parents treat their grandfather with the respect he deserved. "I think," I said, "that sounds like a perfect Christmas gift." And for the first time in 3 years, I meant it. The dining room felt different with me sitting at the head of the table, not just because I was in a different chair, but because the whole energy of the room had shifted. For months, I'd been orbiting around the edges of my own family's conversations. Now I was back at the center, where I belonged, where I'd always belonged, but had somehow forgotten. Sarah was bustling around, trying to fix things in that way daughters do when they realize they've hurt their father's feelings. She brought me fresh coffee in Helen's good cup, rearranged the remaining food so I had access to everything, even lit the candles she'd placed on the table but hadn't bothered to use until now. "Dad, are you sure you have enough to eat?" she asked for the third time in 5 minutes. "I can make you some fresh eggs, or there's more sausage in the kitchen." "Sarah," I said gently, "sit down. I have plenty to eat." What I had was more than food. I had my place back. I had my daughter's attention focused on me instead of scattered between managing Margaret's comfort and her children's needs. I had my son-in-law looking at me like I was a person worth consulting instead of an elderly relative to be managed carefully. Most importantly, I had my grandchildren seeing me as someone who mattered enough to stand up for himself. "Grandpa?" Tommy asked, working his way through a pile of Christmas pancakes that Sarah had apparently made from scratch. "Are you mad at us?" It was such a direct question, the kind only children ask, and it deserved an honest answer. "No, Tommy," I said. "I'm not mad at you or Emma. I was sad that I wasn't getting to spend as much time with you as I wanted to." "But you're here all the time," Emma pointed out with 7-year-old logic. "You live here." "Living somewhere and belonging somewhere aren't always the same thing," I explained, trying to find words that would make sense to them. "Sometimes people can be in the same house but not really be together." Emma considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. She was Helen's granddaughter through and through, thoughtful, observant, always trying to understand the deeper currents in adult conversations. "Is that why you were eating different food than everyone else?" she asked. "Yes, sweetheart, that's exactly why." Mark had been quiet during this exchange, but now he cleared his throat. "Mr. Patterson, Bill, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." I looked at him with surprise. Mark and I had always gotten along well enough, but we'd never been particularly close. He was a good husband to Sarah and a devoted father to the children, but he'd always seemed a little intimidated by me, like he wasn't quite sure how to relate to his wife's father. "You don't owe me anything, Mark." "Yes, I do," he insisted. "When we moved in here, I should have been more thoughtful about boundaries, about making sure you still felt like the head of your own household." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "And I should have stood up for you when Margaret started taking over. I could see what was happening, but I didn't say anything because her help made Sarah's life easier. That was selfish of me." This was more honesty than Mark and I had shared in the 5 years he'd been married to Sarah. I appreciated it, but I also wanted to be fair. "Mark, you were trying to take care of your family. I can't fault you for that." "But I wasn't taking care of all my family," he said. "I was taking care of Sarah and the kids, but I wasn't considering you. Your family too. And I forgot that." Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. "Dad, we all forgot that. Not intentionally, but we got so focused on managing our own stress, our own problems, that we stopped thinking about how our solutions were affecting you." Her hand was warm, and I realized how long it had been since my daughter had touched me with genuine affection instead of the careful, duty-bound contact of someone checking on an elderly relative. "Tell me something," I said. "When you were growing up, did you ever doubt that you belonged in this family? Did you ever feel like you had to earn your place here?" "Never," Sarah said immediately. "You and Mom made sure I always knew I was wanted, that I belonged here no matter what." "Then why," I asked gently, "did you think it was okay for me to feel like I had to earn my place? Why did you think it was acceptable for me to eat leftovers while Margaret got the good china? Why did you assume I preferred to be excluded instead of asking if I wanted to be included?" Sarah's tears started fresh, and I squeezed her hand to let her know I wasn't trying to hurt her, just trying to help her understand. "I don't know," she whispered. "I honestly don't know how it got to that point." "I do," I said. "It got to that point because I let it. Because I was so afraid of being a burden after Mom died that I made myself invisible. Because I was so grateful for any attention at all that I accepted less and less until I was accepting nothing." Mark leaned forward. "But we should have noticed. We should have seen what was happening and stopped it." "Yes," I agreed. "You should have. But I should have spoken up sooner instead of waiting until I was eating cold turkey on Christmas morning to finally say something." Tommy had finished his pancakes and was listening to this adult conversation with the serious attention children give to discussions they know are important even if they don't understand all the details. "Grandpa," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you like Grandma Margaret?" It was such an innocent question, but it cut right to the heart of something I'd been struggling with for months. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that you can like someone and still resent the way they've taken over your life? "I think Margaret is a very nice lady," I said carefully. "She's kind to you and Emma, and she tries to help your parents with a lot of things." "But you don't like her being here all the time," Emma observed with that uncanny insight children sometimes have. "It's not that I don't like Margaret being here," I explained. "It's that I started to feel like she was more important to this family than I was, like everyone would rather spend time with her than with me." "That's not true," Tommy protested. "I like spending time with you, Grandpa." "I know you do, buddy. But when was the last time we did something together, just you and me? When was the last time I helped you with your homework, or read you a story, or taught you something new?" Tommy thought about this seriously. "I don't remember," he admitted. "That's not your fault," I assured him. "It's mine, for not making sure we had that time together. And it's the grown-ups' fault for not making sure Grandpa had a chance to be a grandpa." Sarah was really crying now. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize. I never meant to push you out of their lives." "I know you didn't mean to, but that's what happened. Margaret became the grandparent who helped with homework and planned fun activities and remembered important events. I became the old man who lived in the basement and stayed out of the way." "The guest room isn't the basement," Sarah protested weakly. "It felt like the basement," I said. "It felt like I'd been moved to the least important part of the house so more important people could use the better rooms." Mark was nodding slowly. "When we first moved in, you offered to take the downstairs room. We should have realized you were just being polite. We should have insisted you keep your own bedroom." "I offered because I thought it was temporary," I said. "I thought you'd be here for a few weeks or months, and then I'd get my room back, my routine back, my place in the family back. I didn't realize I was giving them up permanently." "But it doesn't have to be permanent," Sarah said quickly. "We can change things. We can make sure you feel welcome in your own home again." "How?" I asked, not sarcastically but genuinely curious. "How do we change Pa? Turns we've spent 6 months establishing. How do you uninvite someone who's become essential to your daily life? How do I become a grandfather to children who've learned to depend on someone else?" The questions hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of problems that didn't have easy solutions. You can't undo months of feeling invisible with one conversation, no matter how honest or well-intentioned. But Emma, with the straightforward thinking that only children possess, offered the simplest answer. "We could just start doing things different," she said. "Like from now on, everyone gets fancy plates, and Grandpa gets to help with homework sometimes. And we could do stuff together that's just our family, without Grandma Margaret." "That's a very good idea, Emma," I said, smiling at her. "But it means everyone has to remember to include Grandpa instead of just assuming he wants to be left alone." "I'll remember," Tommy promised solemnly. I'll make sure you get fancy plates. Sarah laughed through her tears. We all will, Dad. We'll all remember. Looking around the table at my family, really looking at them, seeing them as people who loved me but had gotten lost in the complexity of managing a household and raising children and dealing with an aging parent, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt hope. Not the desperate hope that comes from wanting something you're afraid you'll never get, but the calm hope that comes from knowing that people who love you are willing to do better once they understand how to do better. Okay, I said. Let's try starting different. Let's try being a family that includes everyone, instead of managing around the people who seem like they might need less attention. Starting right now? Sarah asked. Starting right now, I agreed. But first, I think we need to talk about Margaret. The table went quiet again, but not with the uncomfortable silence we'd had. Earlier, this was the silence of people preparing to have a difficult but necessary conversation. Because, I continued, Margaret isn't the problem. The problem is that we never figured out how to include her in our family without excluding me, and that's something we're going to have to solve together if we want this to work for everyone. Sarah nodded slowly. You're right. We need to figure out how to make room for everyone without making anyone feel like they don't belong. Exactly, I said. Because this is my house, and you're my family, and Margaret is someone we all care about. There has to be a way to honor all of those things at once. Looking at my family gathered around the table I'd built with my own hands, eating Christmas breakfast off the china Helen and I had chosen together 40 years ago, I realized something important. This wasn't just about getting my place back. This was about learning how to be a family that had room for everyone. The grieving widower, the overwhelmed young parents, the generous outsider who wanted to help, and the children who needed to see their grandfather as someone worth including, not just someone to be managed. It was about learning how to expand with love instead of contracting with fear. And for the first time in 3 years, I believed we could figure it out. 3 months later, I'm sitting at my dining room table, my table, at my place, in my house, writing this story, and thinking about how much can change when people decide to see each other clearly instead of just managing around each other's needs. It didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't always smooth. Real change, the kind that shifts family dynamics that have been building for months or years, takes time and patience and a lot of conversations that feel awkward until they start feeling normal. But that Christmas morning, when I finally stopped accepting leftovers and started insisting on my rightful place at the table, something shifted for all of us. It's not perfect. There are still moments when I feel like the old man who slows everyone down, or when Margaret's natural take-charge personality overrides my quieter approach to family involvement. But now we talk about those moments, instead of just letting them pile up until someone is eating leftovers on Christmas morning. The biggest change, though, has been in my relationship with my grandchildren. Tommy and Emma had learned to see me as background furniture. Present, but not particularly interesting. Available, but not particularly engaging. I'd let that happen by withdrawing into my grief instead of figuring out how to be an active grandfather while I was learning how to be a single person. Now Tommy and I have Wednesday afternoon projects in my workshop. We've built birdhouses and simple wooden toys, and we're currently working on a model airplane that may or may not ever actually fly. He's learning to use tools safely, and I'm remembering how much I enjoy teaching someone who's genuinely interested in learning. Emma and I have Saturday morning cooking sessions. We make pancakes from scratch, try new cookie recipes, and work our way through Helen's old recipe collection. She's too young to handle the stove by herself, but she can measure ingredients and mix batter and learn the patience that good cooking requires. These aren't earth-shattering activities, but they're ours. Time that belongs to me and my grandchildren, relationships that don't depend on anyone else's schedule or approval or financial contribution. Sarah has changed too, in ways that go beyond just remembering to set me a proper place at the dinner table. She's started asking my opinion about things again, not just polite questions designed to make me feel included, but genuine requests for advice from someone whose judgment she trusts. Dad, what do you think about Tommy's teacher's suggestion that he might be ready for advanced math classes? She asked last week. I don't want to push him too hard, but I also don't want to hold him back if he's ready for more challenge. We had a real conversation about it, the kind where she listened to my thoughts, shared her own concerns, and we worked together toward a decision that felt right for Tommy. I felt like a father again, not just an elderly relative whose opinion gets solicited out of politeness. The truth is, that Christmas morning when I finally stopped accepting leftovers taught all of us something we'd forgotten. That family isn't just about love, it's about respect. It's about seeing each other clearly instead of just managing around each other's perceived limitations. It's about making space for everyone to contribute their gifts instead of assuming that some people's contributions matter more than others. Helen would be proud, I think, of how we figured it out. She always believed that problems were just solutions, waiting to be discovered by people who cared enough to keep working at them. She would have been horrified to see me eating cold food on Christmas morning, but she would have been proud to see me finally stand up and insist on better. "Don't let grief turn you into a ghost," she'd said, and I'd broken that promise for 3 years. But that Christmas morning, I learned that you can choose to stop being a ghost. You can choose to become fully present in your own life again, even if it means having uncomfortable conversations and insisting on respect you shouldn't have to ask for. I'm still learning how to be a single person after 45 years of being half of a couple. I'm still figuring out how to be an aging father without becoming a burden to my daughter. I'm still working on how to share my grandchildren's affection with another grandparent without feeling like there isn't enough love to go around. But I'm not learning these things from the margins anymore. I'm not figuring them out while eating leftovers in the kitchen. I'm working on them as a full member of my family, someone whose comfort and preferences and feelings matter as much as anyone else's. The dining room table I built with my own hands 40 years ago is still the center of our family life. We eat Sunday dinners there together, all of us, including Margaret when she visits. We play board games there on rainy afternoons. The children do homework there while I help Tommy with his math and Emma practices her handwriting. And every morning I eat my breakfast there, at my place, at my table, in my house. Not because I demanded it or because anyone feels sorry for me, but because that's where I belong. That's where I've always belonged. Sometimes I look around that table and think about all the meals Helen and I shared there, all the conversations and arguments and celebrations that happened in those chairs. I think about Sarah growing up at that table, learning table manners and family values and the art of conversation. Now I'm watching my grandchildren learn those same things, and I'm not watching from the kitchen with a paper plate. I'm participating, contributing, being present in ways that matter. That's the lesson that Christmas morning taught all of us. That love is not enough if it comes without respect. That family is not enough if it comes without inclusion. That gratitude is not enough if it comes instead of dignity. And sometimes, when people you love forget that you matter, the most loving thing you can do is remind them, even if it means switching the plates and serving everyone exactly what they deserve, even if it means insisting on your rightful place at the table you built with your own hands, in the home you created with your own sweat, with the family you loved with your whole heart for longer than anyone else in that room. Even if it means refusing to be grateful for leftovers when you deserve a seat at the feast. Because you do deserve it. We all do. Every single one of us deserves to be seen, valued, included, and respected by the people we love most. And sometimes that's a lesson worth teaching, one plate at a time.